Whenever you're ready, Gonzalo, go ahead.
Well, very good. Thank you very much. Indeed, today we are going to start on the fourth session, right? Which is about the blocks of consciousness. Well, I have already touched on the three eyes of knowledge. It was something we touched on in the first session. Just to remind you that all philosophers, Christian and non-Christian, the Eastern ones, everyone agrees on this point. For example, if you are interested in this, it was very well developed in the West by Saint Bonaventure, and curiously in the East and around the same historical time, well, Nagarjuna, right, who is a great Buddhist philosopher. But ultimately, they are saying the same thing, and simply it is important to remember that these wise men spoke and explained and that human beings have three eyes to receive knowledge about reality. The eye of the flesh is the most basic, which is the eye of science, no, of measurement. Then we had the eye of the mind, right, which Saint Bonaventure called intelligibilia, which served us for doing philosophy, playing chess, or doing mathematics. And then we had a third eye, which is the eye of contemplation, which Saint Bonaventure called in Latin transcendalia, right? We also said in the first session that people generally make a great effort, right, in improving the eye of reason, right, through education, university careers, and so on, etc., etc. But only a few people made the effort to develop the eye of contemplation. And therefore, it makes sense that if not everyone makes an effort to develop it, humanity has not developed it much yet, right? But the eye of contemplation is needed to discuss today's topic, which is the mystical consciousness, right? So before I start saying anything, I want to warn that trying to explain what mystical consciousness is using normal language or the mind is difficult, right? That's why many spiritual teachers have said that one of the greatest services that can be done for humanity is to try in some way to make understandable what is truly ineffable, right? Because, as we will see later, the mystical experience is transmental and therefore cannot be reduced to the mental. And mystics try to explain their experiences as best they can, but being very aware that it is never a complete explanation, right? And with that warning, we're going to talk a little about what this mystical consciousness is and how it appears in the and what we can do to facilitate it. So the first thing we need to understand, I believe, is that consciousness researchers are saying today that here on Earth, right, on this planet, there are like 3 blocks of consciousness available for living beings, right? And so, for example, Raymond Buche, who is one of the most well-known researchers in this, has stated, and I think he is right, you know, that we have 3 blocks available to us, right? We can say the first available block is what they call simple consciousness, right? Which is the one that advanced animals have, for example, right? It is capable of well, having capacity, of course, instinctive, even advanced animals, emotional, right? As we see, for example, in some dogs, but it is not capable of developing language or thinking abstractly. They can perform concrete mental operations. For example, if you throw a bone into a large rectangular pool, a dog will always jump in from the closest spot to the bone, right? So its mind can perform concrete operations, somewhat like small human children can, but it is not capable of developing an abstract mind. The second block of consciousness is what they call self-awareness. And it's really where I would say 99 point something percent of humanity is established. It's a consciousness that already allows for language, that allows for abstract reasoning, which allows us to learn to play chess, for example. And well, that block of consciousness is well known to everyone, so there's no need to dwell on it too much. It is, let's say, the egoic consciousness, to call it something, right? Where everything is governed by the ego, by the set of the three lower bodies, which include the mental body, and therefore there is the capacity for abstract reasoning, right? But there is a third block of consciousness, which we are going to talk about more today, that you will have seen in the books with three different names. Some call it mystical consciousness, others call it universal consciousness, right? Others call it cosmic consciousness. I like to call it mystical consciousness, right? And that's what we will call it in the conference. And the first thing to highlight is that this block of consciousness is an evolutionary necessity of the soul, right? Therefore, sooner or later, whatever vision each person has of what happens, right? After physical death, it is a block of consciousness that the soul must pass through at some point of its purification, right? To then continue advancing to other possible blocks of consciousness that we can't even imagine, right? But here on earth, that is the highest level, right? So notice that from the second block of consciousness, from self-awareness, you can believe in God, or you can try to know intellectually some of its characteristics, but you cannot experience its presence, right? If we want to experience the presence of God in a solid and profound way, and of course, as we have to open ourselves to the third block of consciousness, which is this mystical, cosmic, or universal consciousness, right? Notice also that this whole field has started to be studied scientifically, yeah? Recently, let's say in the last 2 decades or more, of course, as long as we understand that, as we said in the first session, it's not empirical science, but it is science in the broad sense of the term, although the scientific method is indeed starting to be used, right, to investigate these realities. And well, there are many authors who are doing it, who have done it. I will name a few in case you are interested in reading more about it. One is Bucke, B-U-C-K-E. Another is Ken Wilber. Another is Underhill, right? Or James. Well, there are many other authors, but in my opinion, these are the ones doing the best work. Huh? And well, if you're interested, you can look at their books, right? On the subject of the three eyes of knowledge, I recommend to everyone an extraordinary book, which is not very long or heavy, but is very good, called The Three Eyes of Knowledge by Ken with K, Ken Wilber with W, right? Wilber. And I think it will, or it can clarify a lot for all of us about this whole matter of today's session, right? So we also have to know that many times what is seen from mystical consciousness can be confronting for the ego consciousness, right? It is not the first time that what the mystics have expressed has somewhat puzzled, hasn't it? That the theologians or intellectuals or people who are operating more on a mental level, because sometimes it is difficult to explain and hard to understand from that other block of consciousness, right? That's why many times mystics have to blend in with others, because it's true that they can feel misunderstood, right? Let's see. What can facilitate our entry into the third block of consciousness, which is what I believe everyone aspires to, right? And that's why we pursue the contemplative and meditative path. And well, we are interested in these matters, aren't we? I mean, the first requirement, in my opinion, to be able to enter that block of consciousness is fundamentally inner peace, right? Unshakable inner peace, right? In the face of the external. Why is this so? Because when we are not at peace internally, we experience internal conflict, which can be emotional, sentimental, or mental, right? And that conflict, right, lowers our vibration and acts as a barrier so that the highest level information can reach us, right? I usually just give the example in some of my lectures, right? That if on a sunny day, we go out to the garden, well, the sun is going to shine on us, And the only way the sun won't shine on us is if we use an umbrella or a parasol. That blocks the sun's rays and the sun doesn't shine on us anymore, right? So what blocks our access to that block of consciousness? Establishing ourselves in the ego, right? The ego is the locus of fears. It is the locus of worries, of lack of peace, of internal conflicts. And with that, we are energetically blocking, as we saw in the first session, the ability to receive higher level information, right? Of course, in addition to inner peace, which as we will see in the acceptance session, and we have already seen in some of the first sessions, is reached more quickly through the acceptance of reality. Well, of course, when we accept reality, the egoic desire ceases, right? And when the egoic desire ceases, that's when all these possibilities open up, right? It's one of the central teachings of both Christianity and Buddhism, isn't it? And we have to understand it, don't we? Of course, in addition to inner peace, we need to be humble, know that this, just as everything egoic, depends more on us and is more under our control, the mystical experience is not. And therefore, if we don't have humility, right, to open ourselves to what may or may not come, it will be difficult for it to appear, right? And we also have to, in some way, become like children, right? When this block of consciousness appears, because we have to kind of relearn everything anew, right? Maybe for me, it's the meaning of the evangelical words, right? When the gospel tells us that if we want to discover the inner kingdom, we have to become like children because we need to be open, right? To something that at first, as we will see now, can be very disconcerting, but we need to have the humility and openness, right? To be able to follow that process, right? And we have to relearn. I mean, a person who enters into mystical consciousness, well, of course, has, as we will see, very different characteristics, but it doesn't mean one is infallible, right? And one has to keep learning, right? From the beginning, everything that is that block, which we will also see is more of a process than an event, right? Another important thing to point out is that the way to achieve it is not so much through our personal efforts, but if we stubbornly try to attain it egoistically, we will make it more difficult, right? It will hinder it. And I think our work should be to make it easier. It's to make it appear, isn't it? Not that we are going to achieve it. And we make it appear, I insist, when we transcend the ego and transcend the egoic conflict, right? Because that raises our vibration, and by raising our vibration, it can connect more easily, right, with the higher vibrations of this block of consciousness. So this idea is important, isn't it? Because many times it's the ego that wants to be mystical, isn't it? And that is going to make it difficult for us, right? It's more that we work on the transcend the ego, you know, so that the consciousness, that block of consciousness can manifest. I mean, it's almost, if you will, more useful to do indirect work, right, than direct, right? This, of course, does not mean that one should not engage in meditative and contemplative practice, which will also help facilitate it. But above all, we must remove the obstacles more than trying to achieve it, right? And that's an idea I want you to keep in mind, right? What can be some of the characteristics, right, of this mystical awareness when it appears? Well, you'll see that the intuitive capacity develops a lot. It no longer follows a sequential process of A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, right? Typical of the mind, right, to operate. But rather that in some way, there is always like a direct apprehension of the information or of the wisdom, right? On the other hand, another of its characteristics is that we clearly see the unity of all that is created with God and of God with all that is created, especially at the highest levels of mysticism, which we will now explain. And intuition and unity are two of its basic characteristics. The other characteristic can be the transcendence of the ego, right? And it is an experience we need to know is beyond the mental, right? Truth is not mental, and therefore the previous concepts or prior knowledge of self-awareness, when this mystical awareness appears, no longer have much value, right? And that's why it is said that you have to relearn everything as if you were a child, right? It's always, moreover, a transformative experience for the personality, right? This is very important to say. I mean, a person who has had a mystical experience is not the same as before, right? It's their whole personality is transformed. And in this, it's quite similar to people who have had a near-death experience, right? That, or close to death, that when they return from that experience, well, they claim that their life has changed, right? The purpose, the personality, everything, right? So the mystical experience does this in an even more powerful way, doesn't it? And another characteristic is that it's a consciousness in which all polarity ceases, right? Good and evil and cold and hot, because only you see that only love exists, and there can be an absence of love, but nothing contrary to love, so to speak. It's interesting that this was affirmed very well by St. Paul, for example, right? In his famous phrase, he says, he calls it the inner kingdom. I call it mystical consciousness. We can call it whatever we want, but it's the same idea, right? And St. Paul says it cannot be to reach, let's say, when one reaches the inner realm, well, there is a release from suffering, from sin, and from death, right? Because another characteristic of this consciousness is a great sense of immortality, right? Even a certain hurry to return home, right? If you remember, once again, the mystics have affirmed this, right? For example, St. Paul, who will free me from this body of death? Or for example, Teresa of Avila, I die because I do not die, right? Then yes, there is a certain hurry to return home, and it often comes accompanied by a neglect in caring for the body or the lower bodies, which is not correct, but at first we may have that symptom. Let's see. Mystical consciousness is not just a single event, right? It can start with an event, right? But then it becomes a process, doesn't it? Like everything else in the universe. And many authors have written about this process of mystical experience. I believe that, for example, Ken Wilber explains it very well. But anyway, everyone agrees, and the mystics also more or less agree on what I'm going to tell you. For instance, consider the 7 dwellings of Saint Teresa or the 3 levels of Saint John of the Cross. Well, then we can divide it into 3 levels, 7 levels, 4 levels, and that can be debatable or subjective. For example, there are many people, myself included, who believe that the first 3 dwellings of Saint Teresa are not truly mystical, but rather pre-mystical, right? But well, in the last 4, she perfectly coincides with Saint John of the Cross and all the other mystics who have described it, right? There is very little variation. Let's see. Explaining these levels is not easy, but let's try to do it this way. Let's consider valid the levels of Saint John of the Cross, the ones Wilber explains at the same time, just like Saint John of the Cross, right? Or Eastern mystics. Now, well, let's say there are 4 levels, right? And the first level of mysticism is what is called natural mysticism, right? It is that level where you have an enormous experience of unity, right? With everything created, right? With all of creation and with everything created. And for example, a good exponent of that level in the West could be Ralph Waldo Emerson. And one in the East could be Suzuki, right? Within the Zen tradition, right? And it's an experience of total unity, right? With all creation. And it's an experience that blows your mind, and that it transforms your personality and purpose in life. The second level, we could call it, or these authors call it, theistic mysticism, right? there what's produced is not just a unity with all of creation, but a unity with a transcendent God and creation, and an understanding of the presence of a transcendent and immanent God in creation, right? That would be, let's say, the second level as the process advances. Notice that a common characteristic of these first two levels, the soul sees the rest of the human being, that is the mind, the physical body, the body as an object, not as an I. People who have egoic consciousness see the ego as a self, and they think that we also have a soul. I'm not sure if I'm explaining myself right, but this in the first two levels of mystical experience, this changes, and then the person identifies with the soul, and the soul sees the rest of the bodies as an object, not as an I. It's the soul that has an ego while incarnated, but it doesn't see itself as an ego, rather as a soul. And you see others also as souls, right? Of course, when that happens, one of the first things that occurs is that, of course, that's why the experience of unity, because who is the father of my soul and who is the father of your soul, right? And it is the same father. Then on a soul level, we are all siblings, aren't we? So as the process progresses, we are already understanding more things. And in the second two higher levels of mysticism, all vestiges of personality have disappeared, even any prior concept we might have about anything. And what distinguishes those two higher levels, right, from the two lower levels is that from the two higher levels, you no longer identify with just your soul. You identify with the essence or divine image that is in the soul. You even come to see the soul as an object, not just the ego anymore, but the soul as an object, right? And your identification happens with the divine image or essence, which is our fifth body, and that dwells in the soul, right? St. John of the Cross, for example, explains this very well. And for example, experts say that Teresa of Avila, for example, reached the first two levels, right? And yet San Juan de la Cruz reached the third level. And experts say that, for example, in the West, a clear example of having reached the four levels is, for example, Meister Eckhart, right? And if you are interested in reading Meister Eckhart, well, you are going to see it clearly, aren't you? Like how he expresses it. It includes everything expressed before by St. John of the Cross or Teresa of Calcutta, but even adds, right, something more that St. John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila did not manage to explain, right, or to communicate. So, well, we need to know that when this block is opened, we will go through a process, and that this process, more or less, will have some of these characteristics, which I have tried to, let's say, mention, right? More things, let's see. One thing that occurs when mystical consciousness begins to open, is that there is a certain tendency or inclination to leave the world, in quotes, right? I mean, the world is something that even starts to give you a bit of aversion. It seems like you're playing make-believe, right? I mean, you already played cowboys and Indians when you were little, and it's no longer the time for that. And as you need moments of reflection, right, and moments to experience it, there's a great temptation, I assure you, to leave the world behind, right? And say, well, look, this is very nice, but for me, it no longer concerns me. I have seen something else, and coming back down to worldly matters at first does give you some aversion and reluctance, But as the process progresses, since the mystical experience ultimately is a union with God and with creation, it does become easier, doesn't it, to return to the world as the process progresses, although one returns to the world in a different way, right? Already with a transcended ego and with much compassion and a great desire to serve. And, well, the mystical consciousness, when it returns to the world, somehow it has to use the consciousness of the self again. Because when you're having a mystical experience, you can't even speak. I mean, no, you are somehow incapacitated, right? For normal functioning in the world. What happens is that since the consciousness of the self continues to be available, right? Because each block of consciousness includes and transcends the previous one, doesn't it? Therefore, a mystic has at their disposal the consciousness of the self and has simple consciousness available, if they want to use it, right? However, a person with simple consciousness does not have the ego consciousness or mystical consciousness available, right? Therefore, it is this idea of always transcending and including and transcending, not dissociating. Because of course, if ego consciousness is eliminated, well, a mystic couldn't even speak or think or drive a car. I don't know if I'm explaining myself right. So, well, this needs to be understood, right? Don't worry if when this starts to happen, you find that, damn, you lose complete interest, right, in worldly things, because that happens. And well, you have to have patience and calm, because then you can return to the world, right, without ever losing as a backdrop, that block of consciousness. But in order to communicate, to operate, to sign a check, right, one does those things from the consciousness of the self, right? And the famous dark night of the soul that many mystics have spoken about, well, once again, it seems to me that deep down is a lack of understanding, right, of the experience itself, isn't it? Because of course, for example, if I like sports as I do, I might wish, right, that it were daytime 24 hours a day, right? Because at night it's harder to play sports, especially if there are no artificial lights, right? But of course, I understand that the universe has a rhythm, right? And that every 12 hours or whatever, it will become day or night. And I understand that this is the will of God. And I understand that this is nature, right? And therefore, it doesn't make me nervous and so on when it becomes night, right? Because of course, the mystical experience, as we will also see now, it consists of two different themes. One thing are peak experiences, and another thing is the settling into mystical consciousness, right? Because of course, if we live 24 hours with peak experiences, well, which are wonderful, by the way, but we wouldn't be able to operate in the world, right? So of course, yeah, sometimes it has happened to mystics that this peak experience starts to end, right? And of course, they want to return to it as quickly as possible, don't they? And they don't understand that the nature of the mystical experience is like that, like the nature of daylight, where half is day and half is night, right? And therefore, there is no need to worry, right? Nor should one be anxious because the mystical experience decreases in intensity, because I insist, if it were not so, well, as some of you might already know, we wouldn't be able to operate in the world, right? I saw that someone in the chat was asking what level Jesus reached. Well, all levels, right? Otherwise, he wouldn't be Jesus. And probably there are more that we are unaware of, right? So I am sure of that, right? And therefore, well, I believe that the entire message of Jesus is a mystical message, and that sometimes we have misinterpreted it because we have tried to interpret it with the mind. And of course, you cannot interpret with the mind. A mystical message, and to capture all its depth, right? Or all its beauty, right? So let's see. Another important thing to clarify also. The thing is that the mystical experience is neither emotional nor sentimental. Notice that from the mystical experience, one does not think I am happy, rather, one knows I am joy. I don't know if I am explaining myself. I mean, there is no longer a personality that is one way or another, but you become one with whatever it may be, right? And therefore, it's curious, but you won't hear a mystic say, I am happy. Probably the mystic will say, I am joy, which is very different from being happy, right? Well, more things I would like to mention to you. Notice that from a mystical consciousness, individuality is valued, but not because I am an ego separated from others, but because each of us is a place of God's revelation in the world, right?
And that is what makes mystics value individuality, isn't it? But if not, then what exists is an experience of union, right? And we have to take that into account. One does not reach the mystical experience through orthodoxy, nor through the observation of moral rules, because it is not about perfecting the ego alone, right? But rather it's about a transcendence of the ego. Of course, it is very difficult to transcend an ego that is not perfected. Sometimes it has happened. It happened to Saint Paul, right? That he had quite an imperfect ego and fell off the horse, the path, whatever, and in 24 hours, boom, right? But generally speaking, and except for those exceptions, because in the universe anything is possible, it does require perfection of virtues, right? And of the ego before being able to transcend it. But it must be clear that one does not arrive through the perfection of the ego, but it demands the transcendence of the ego, which is a point beyond perception, right? Of course, in mystical consciousness, suffering ceases because suffering is a mental resistance to what happens. And mystical consciousness perfectly understands that everything that happens is the will of God and that it is perfect for the development of souls. And therefore, there is nothing to suffer over, right? And the mystical experience also understands that physical reality is not the most real, right? That true reality is spiritual. And therefore, the events that occur in consciousness, let's say in the third dimension or in physical reality, well, they are not really very relevant, right? And that they only have the function of helping the development of the soul, right? Let's see. When entering mystical consciousness, there are a series of very clear physical and mental changes, right? For example, one lives in joy. Inner peace is palpable. I mean, palpable, right? As I mentioned before, there is a certain urgency to return home, isn't there? And above all, there is an enormous loss of fear, right? I mean, there's no fear of anything anymore because one knows that one is one with God and in his hands. And there's nothing to fear, that everything will end wonderfully, and that this is nothing more than an expression of the law of love in action with a pedagogical intent, right? For the children of God who are the souls, right? This mystical experience is contagious. The people who have it or who are engaged in mystical consciousness tend to have great charisma. It boosts the immune system, develops a lot of compassion, and greatly increases the desire to serve, right? Because, of course, when one has entered that state of consciousness, I mean, they have a strong interest and a great desire to help others do it too, right? Because, of course, they realize that that it's something else, isn't it? I mean, when one has lived in self-consciousness and suddenly one settles into mystical consciousness, well, of course, it's that. So, I don't know. I think the gap between ego consciousness and mystical consciousness is sometimes greater than the gap between simple consciousness and ego consciousness. That's why I say that this classification that we have of animals and human beings, we need to modify it, right? And we have to talk about animals with emotional capacity, about human beings in self-awareness and human beings in mystical consciousness, right? And so a classification that used to be of 2 elements, well, now we turn it into 4 elements, right? All right, what else can we say that might be of interest to you? Let's see. When one enters the mystical consciousness, one of the first things you will also see that happens is a total loss of interest, right? For any intellectual or dogmatic discussion or, you know, it is no longer of interest. It is the preferred game of the lower mind. It may interest intellectuals or theologians or philosophers. But mystics are not interested in any dogmatic or intellectual discussion because what they seek is an experience of unity and they seek convergence, right, among all human beings. And as still Hardechan rightly said, in my opinion, well, everything that rises converges, right? Therefore, from up there, as you see, the teachings, many of the central teachings of Buddhism or Christianity are identical, right? Expressed by the founders, right? But of course, where you see more difference, right, is when the Buddhist monk on the corner or the priest on the corner speaks. But up there, there are no differences and certainly no interest in engaging in any intellectual discussion because they have all seen the same thing, right? Okay. Another thing you will have to keep in mind is that at the beginning of the entry into mystical consciousness, a kind of foggy zone occurs, right? I mean, the transition from ego consciousness to mystical consciousness. It is not a clear, definite, or obvious step, right? Instead, you will see that a kind of foggy zone occurs, where sometimes we are still acting from the consciousness of the self, and little by little, let's say, you start acting more from that other block of consciousness that we can call mystical. It's a bit of the feeling you'll have, well, as if you're a bit with both legs apart, right? I call it espataro, you know, with one foot in one block and the other foot in the other block. Then you're going to see that under stress, we always tend to return to ego consciousness, right? Like a familiar place, a comfort zone. If we are not stressed and are at inner peace, we will start operating from the other consciousness. And what's going to happen is that this leg will gradually move closer to the other until finally, boom, they come together and you settle here, let's say, definitely, right? But don't be afraid that at the beginning of the process, a zone that I call a nebulous zone. I say nebulous because you're not very clear which of the two blocks you're in, right? And it's opening up and you don't understand. I mean, and it's different and the other one is there, right? And until you completely let go of this one, well, you do not make this full transfer to this other side. That first phase can be a little confusing and disconcerting, but don't worry. Keep persevering, keep opening yourselves to it, because little by little, it will resolve itself, right? Let's see. Another important point to clarify is that it's not good to confuse mystical experience with altered states of consciousness, right? Let's see. We all know that altered states of consciousness exist, that you can access them. Well, through, well, I don't know, artificial means like a LSD or mushrooms or, I don't know, right? Or holotropic breathing. Or, well, through many other methods, right? Let's see. This does not mean that it does not produce an altered state of consciousness where you can have some, I don't know, some effect, right? Of what different from normal consciousness. But it's not a mystical experience, right? Among other things, because it is not transformative of the personality like the mystical experience is. And because those altered states of consciousness are more aimed at having a happy self, right? Or to a different self or to a distinct self, but not to a non-self, okay? In some way, altered states of consciousness can be more pre-personal than transpersonal, right? A bit like the symbiotic union of a baby with its mother, right? But that is pre-personal. I don't know if I'm explaining myself, right? And what we are trying to explain here, it's the transpersonal world, right? And it's very different from the pre-personal, because of course, the pre-personal world must go through the personal to reach the transpersonal, right? And then that should not be confused, right? And you shouldn't put the two things on the same level, right? Well, the altered states of consciousness usually have a very clear emotional component. And the mystical experience is not emotional, it is trans-emotional. In fact, mystical consciousness first produces a great stillness, right? Of emotions and feelings, as we were saying earlier, right? All right. Another issue to address, to explore, is that, as you know, there has been much controversy or much discussion about whether mystical experiences are different, right? Depending on the religious faith a person may have or not have. That is, for example, if the mystical experiences of Catholics, for instance, are different from those of Easterners or more profound, or if there is something different, right? Let's see. I respect all opinions, of course, but my answer to that is fundamentally no, right? And I say this because the mystical experience is transmental, and therefore it is transdenominational, right? Because one thing is what I believe, right? And another thing is the mystical experience. So my beliefs prior to having the mystical experience have little influence on the mystical experience itself. How would I explain this? Let's see. When we are dreaming at night, we are asleep, we are dreaming, and the wolves chase us, for example, we cannot voluntarily change the dream. We can only affect the dream we are having when we wake up to a new consciousness and we stop dreaming and enter into control of our mental process. But when I have dreamed at night, I have never been able to control the dream. The dream is what it is. I don't know if I am explaining myself. It may be affected or not affected by things, but at the moment the dream occurs, I have not been able to control it consciously. What I have been able to do is wake up and turn it off, right? But not direct it while it was happening. The mystical experience is similar to that. When it occurs, it does not depend at all on what you see, right? Or what appears as certainty and reality. It does not depend on your prior concept, so to speak, right? Therefore, I believe that this confusion about whether Catholic people, for example, they have mystical experiences different from non-Catholics or Eastern practitioners or whatever, because of their religious upbringing or different faith. I think, look, it's a confusion because I think what they confuse are different experiences with different levels. I mean, let me explain. If, for example, an Oriental mystic has reached the first level of consciousness, right? Xian feels a union with consciousness and with all that is created, but not yet with a transcendent God. That is the first level of experience. And it is the first level for Christians and non-Christians. I don't know if I am explaining myself, right? So, of course, if we are comparing, for example, the writings of Suzuki with the writings of St. John of the Cross, well, of course, there can be differences, right? But of course, if we compare the writings of Ramana Maharshi with those of St. John of the Cross, there is no longer a difference, right? So I believe this is not so much a matter of religious belief, but a matter of levels of mystical experience. For example, I am not the only one saying this. That is to say, Thomas Merton, who is a Christian monk and an expert in contemplation, has written a very beautiful book called The Inner Experience. And he himself states in the book that he has compared, for example, the mystical experience of Bhakti Yoga, right, of some mystics with that of St. John of the Cross and finds them identical, right? So in that sense, well, I think more research is still needed in this field, right? And maybe some of the things I'm saying now, well, might be modified. But my impression is that the mystical experience is a natural experience, right? And that just like all men, all human beings, well, we eat in the same way, even though we eat different food and we sleep in the same way, right? And you'll have to excuse me, but we go to the bathroom the same way, whether we are Eastern or Western. The mystical experience is obviously common because it is transmental, right? And in that sense, it is transconfessional, right? Above all, at the higher levels. Merton also said, in my opinion, rightly, that, for example, in the early stages of mysticism, like Teresa of Avila, Teresa can be a Christian first and then a mystic, right? While in the higher levels, for example, St. John of the Cross or Meister Eckhart, you are first a mystic and then a Christian. So, and that is a topic that needs to be understood. That is why, now, for example, the Catholic Church has never had any problems with Teresa of Avila, but St. John of the Cross and especially Meister Eckhart have had some difficulty being understood, right? Precisely because the more it advances, the mystical consciousness advances, the more it becomes independent from any previous concept, right? And this also needs to be understood so that it doesn't surprise us, right? Let's see. Finally, it's true that sometimes in the religions we might call more dogmatic, as is the case with Western religions, the mystical experiences can sometimes be more challenging because there's more focus on perfecting the ego rather than transcending the ego. Merton and other authors also say that sometimes when you are a member of a Western religion, so naturally when expressing what you have seen in mystical consciousness, it has to be filtered, right, through the dogma or the specific faith of that religion and such. And this makes it difficult for some mystics to express themselves. And we see that maybe this is the case, right? That what is contemplative capacity or has developed more in, I don't know, in maybe in the East than in the West, right? Well, finally, I would also like to clarify something, right? When we talk about contemplation, I think that we can practice two types of contemplation that are a little different. On one hand, there is passive contemplation, right? Where we quiet ourselves to receive an infusion, right, from outside, which is a gift that comes to us from, right, or where it comes from and what we receive as a passive infusion when we are quiet and able to receive it, right? But we can also practice active contemplation. And it is that when we have to act in the world, right? Well, we can act by seeking acceptance of reality, doing our best, and leaving the results of our actions in God's hands, right? Detaching ourselves from the outcome. And that's a way, right, to be able to practice active contemplation, right, which will be complementary, right, to the passive one, right? Both are necessary, but both can accompany us, right, in that process of growth, no? Notice that in some way mystical consciousness is also, I don't like to call it transmoral, right? Perhaps it's not precise, right? But it is indeed beyond objective moral rules, hence the great phrase by St. Augustine, love and do what you will. Of course, right? I mean, when you are in the consciousness of the self, you continuously ask yourself if your actions or behavior are ethical or not ethical, right? Or moral or not moral. And then you turn to the system, for example, of St. Thomas, right? Of object and circumstances, principle, double effect. In short, all that immorality. Well, there is so much debate, but of course, when you are in mystical awareness, all that is useless. I mean, you don't have to do any mental sequencing. You don't have to ask about the object. Of course, the intention is always pure. I don't know how to explain it to you. It's like there's no longer any doubt, right, about what is correct and what is not correct. No? And of course, everything becomes much simpler. And you reach, well, what St. Augustine said or what Christ said, right? In other words, don't do to others what you don't want done to you, right? And don't complicate yourself with 800,000, let's say, intellectual disquisitions, which are useful for the consciousness of the self. But somehow, well, they are not useful for mystical awareness because it's a waste of time, right? Okay. And the last thing I would like to comment on regarding mystical consciousness is the following, so there won't be any confusion about this as there is right now, right? Let's see. We explained in the first sessions, right, that everything meaningful has to have an anchorage in the fundamental or basic. For example, the mind has its anchorage in the brain. If someone hits my brain with a hammer, I can't experience the mind anymore. So the million-dollar question would be, what is the anchorage of the mystical experience? And let's see, here, well, there have been different, as always, different views, right? Those of you who know about this know that, for example, Hindus think that the anchor is in the Kundalini, right? That to have mystical experiences, spiritual energy called Kundalini has to be awakened, which they say is coiled at the base of the spine. And when that energy awakens, right? Well, that's when you start to have access to mystical consciousness, isn't it? Other researchers will place it in the ethereal brain. They say, no, it's that when mystical consciousness is about to open, well, then a quantum brain is created for you, which is not physical, but it is what allows the anchoring of that experience. Other researchers place it in the higher mind, though they say, no, the brain remains the anchor. No? What happens is that the brain is divided into two parts. One is the lower or concrete mind, and the other is the higher mind. And that cerebral capacity of the higher mind is what serves as the anchor for the mystical experience. Others, as you know, place it in the pineal gland, the anchor. And the Christian mystics, in their vast majority, have located the anchor of the mystical experience in the soul. right? What is my opinion? Well, my opinion, as always, is integrative, if possible, because I do not like to divide. I always like to unite. And so I firmly believe that the anchoring of the mystical experience is in the soul, just as the anchoring of the mind is in the brain. The anchoring of the mystical experience is in the soul. But that doesn't mean the soul cannot need that for that different anchoring to occur, right? Then perhaps one must develop the kundalini or the etheric brain or whatever it is. That is, the four things can even coexist together in some way, right? But well, you have to know that, like everything else, the mystical experience must have its anchorage. And regarding this anchorage, there are different opinions. And in my opinion, maybe they are all at once, right? But I place the anchoring of the mystical experience, for better or worse, in the soul, right? Just as I place in the soul, as we have already seen, well, freedom and intention, right, of the human being. And finally, to say that there is also some confusion about whether when one opens up to mystical consciousness, one starts having paranormal or parapsychological abilities, or as they were called in the East, cities, right? And here, what I have to say, so there is no confusion, is that there are many people who in the self-awareness, right? Being in the self-awareness can have parapsychological or paranormal abilities. And this is being studied, and we all know some cases, etc. But having parapsychological or paranormal abilities does not guarantee in any way that the person is in mystical consciousness. The proof is that many people who have these abilities then do not use them well, meaning they do not produce peace with those abilities, right? Or they do not use them solely to be of service, which does not take away from the fact that when you enter mystical consciousness, usually some paranormal or parapsychological ability tends to develop, especially one necessary for the service you are going to perform from there, right? So not everyone with parapsychological abilities is mystical, but almost all mystics tend to have some parapsychological or paranormal capability, right? Yeah, I think that distinction is also important, so that we are not confused by many people who, just because they have parapsychological capabilities, are not at all installed in mystical consciousness. And about that, I know, luckily or unfortunately, more than one case, right? So, well, as it's already time, I won't go on. We'll finish the not so theoretical explanation of all this. And if it's all right with you, we'll open up to questions in the next few minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo. Today, there are many questions. Difficult to choose, huh? Difficult to choose. Let's start. For example, what would be your recommendation, Gonzalo? Your fundamental recommendation to approach this mystical awareness?
Facilitate for it to happen. This is a gift. It's a gift, like everything else in the universe is a gift, but this is a specific gift. What happens to people when they become aligned by law, right? We will see the universal laws in the next session and what that correspondence is. And I, as I also said in the conference, believe it is facilitated through inner peace and about humility, right? And being willing to step out of your comfort zone, right? Being open to a different kind of learning. And well, that is fundamentally for me, there are three facilitators. Well, of course, also the practice, right? Sure, a person who meditates, who contemplates, who tries, is helping the mind experience it, right? Because the mystical experience occurs when the mind is calm. And of course, the ego is calm too, right? If the ego is not calm, there is no mystical experience because it interferes. Therefore, those four things: inner peace, subdued ego, spiritual practice, and surrender, right? So that God grants it whenever he wants or thinks it's the best moment, meaning not having a great egotistical desire to achieve it, right? But rather to go through a process of facilitation.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Julia asks if mystical consciousness can be lost, or once it is attained, does it remain? Does it stay there forever?
I think that usually, normally it remains, okay? It can, I mean, as a process, it remains, right? What happens is you can have peak experiences, right? Premonitory of the process that will come later or anticipated. And those peak experiences can indeed disappear, right? But once the third block of consciousness in the human being opens, normally it tends to continue. Of course, notice that many spiritual teachers say that spiritual growth, it is supported by three pillars, right? Correct information, right? Training and the correct information, and energy management, right? So, of course, many times spiritual teachers are more masters because of their excellent management of energy than because of the other two, right? Because if it's a high energy, as we saw at the beginning of the sessions, it's very difficult, isn't it, to maintain this type of consciousness, right? Where if there's some situation by which a person who has had peak experiences then has their energy lowered, right? Well, either due to an illness or a neglect, right, of their own management, or due to a disorderly life, or for whatever reason, indeed, the mystical process may not continue, right, which requires a high vital energy, right, to be able to occur. But generally speaking, I think that once the process begins, it continues, right? That is my impression or my experience.
Very well. Another question. This came from Tony. Gonzalo, how is personal suffering and the suffering of the world around us experienced from mystical consciousness?
Well, from mystical consciousness, as St. Paul said, and not only me, but I also tell you from experience, there is no possible suffering anymore with the block of mystical consciousness. Suffering disappears. Suffering is a mental resistance to what happens, as I have said more than once. And therefore, as there is no longer resistance to what happens, because one, the mystical consciousness has perfect unity and acceptance, right, of the will of God, well, suffering disappears, doesn't it? So, of course, this is a controversial topic that is, for me, a poor explanation of the gospel, right? When we think that because Christ suffered, we become co-redeemers with Christ by suffering, right? And that is not a good interpretation. I can well assure that if Christ was Christ, he could not have had any mental suffering of any kind, because he expressed many times the idea God and I are one, right? So God does not suffer, and therefore if he is one with God, he does not suffer either. Another thing is, if Christ wanted to experience all the emotions of humanity and all the difficulties and mistakes and the sins and whatever you want in order to redeem them. And another thing is that Christ became equal with others, right? For example, this could happen to a mystic tomorrow. Let's say it turns out you're a mystic, but you have a friend or relative, whatever, who isn't, right? And they lose a loved one, right? You're obviously not going to go there and say, oh, hey, so-and-so, you know what? How wonderful. Let's throw a party. This is marvelous. Your loved one is already home. God has taken them at the right moment. This is great. This is the best thing that could happen to your loved one who is now on vacation and has left the course and such. You don't express yourself that way. Even if you feel it inside, your friend might slap you twice, right? Because they can't understand it that way. So you should never do anything the other person cannot handle, right? And then maybe you adjust yourself and arrive there and say, oh, well, I'm so sorry, right? And such, like when Christ wept, right? For example, at Lazarus's death, right? But man, I think he was adjusting himself, wasn't he? Because of course, the central teaching of Christ is do the will of the Father. And Christ knows that people die when the Father decides. And therefore, he's not going to be saddened by it, because he knows it is the best thing that can happen to that soul. And if others cannot understand it, well, a mystic will blend in and not cause any scandal or fuss. Because I will say that one of the very important rules of service is first do no harm, right? So, of course, you cannot do things that people cannot understand or assimilate, no matter how differently you see them. I already said at the beginning of the conference that many times mystics, they have to feel very misunderstood because they are on a different, in a different order of functioning than normal people. But of course, the mystic can understand the person of the ego, but the person of the ego cannot understand the mystic, which makes it the mystic's job to adjust to the consciousness of the self when in the world and when appropriate, right? Because the other cannot do it even if they want to.
Thank you, Gonzalo. There are several friends who they ask a question, maybe a little personal. They ask you if you could, it seems like you've had experiences of this kind. If you could tell us about these experiences.
No, let's see. I don't know how the answer is yes, thank God, right? And without deserving it in any way, because it is inexplicable that it happened to me. Everything I have told you today in this talk, well, I have not said anything in this talk that I cannot corroborate through personal experience. I haven't reached the final levels, unfortunately. I hope that God grants it to me in the process. But above all, it doesn't matter what I have or haven't done, because I sometimes prefer to quote other people who have studied it, because in the end, the mystical experience is subjective. And no matter how much I talk about my experience, well, it could be mine or someone else's, right? But everything I have tried to say today in the talk is somehow a combination. I mean, I haven't said anything that I couldn't corroborate experientially, but I have wanted to base it in the studies or in the research or in the writings of other people, well, to be able to somehow validate it more, right?
Thank you, Gonzalo. One last question. I will choose. Yes, there is another question that another friend asks if the mystical experience has to be religious. And what if it is the origin of religion?
Let's see. I think that logically, let's see. In our book Espiritualizarse, one of the things that my co-author Rafa Domingo and I say at the end of the axioms, at the end of the book, is the best theology is done by mystics. Jesus gives us a mystical message. Okay, I think the mistake of some religions, but it is not. No one is to blame for that, because everyone's done their best, right? But of course, not everyone is a mystic. And so when a person who is not a mystic tries to explain intellectually, right, or understand only intellectually some of those teachings, well, they have fallen short, right? Or they have not understood the full depth. They have been misinterpreted. For a long time now, I've had less interest in reading or listening to philosophers, to theologians. And yet, I increasingly have more interest in reading and listening to mystics, right? I believe that obviously all religions should focus their efforts on that, so that all the parishioners could reach this level, right? It gives me a bit of, well, not sadness, because I know it's perfect for the development, right, of consciousness. Otherwise, it wouldn't happen. But sometimes I see religions too focused on self-improvement through virtue and not so much on this transcendence of the self, right? And also sometimes they give us many guidelines, to see how we can increase this contemplative capacity or have more ease of entry into mystical consciousness, because they themselves are not mystics, the ministers, right? And so, of course, no one can teach what they don't know or give what they don't have, I think that you see a very famous theologian of these last years, right, named Karl Rahner. He officially stated, the church in the coming century will be mystical or it will not be. I think there's also, I think there is an effort right now with Pope Francis in some way is trying to increase spirituality. Notice that Francis has even stated on YouTube, you can find it. He said something important, right? I think I mentioned it in the session about levels of consciousness, but he said, if you believe that an ordinary priest or nun is more pleasing in the eyes of God than a Gandhi or a Martin Luther King, then no, you are mistaken and you are going to be in for a big surprise when you die, right? I think what the Pope is expressing there is that what truly matters is the level of consciousness, rather than whether you belong to this religion or another, right? And believing this or that, it might be very important for the ego consciousness and very interesting, but when you open up to mystical consciousness, belief ceases. I mean, belief no longer is already replaced by the direct verification of experience, right? It's a bit like if you ask me now, Gonzalo, do you think the moon is round? Well, if I've never seen any photos or had a direct experience and haven't been there, I'll tell you, yes, I believe the moon is round because scientists say so. But once I get to the moon and see what shape it has or what its surface is like, or that I look at a photo, I will verify it, right? That the moon is round, and I no longer need to have any belief about it, right? I believe that mystical consciousness is precisely what replaces, as I said right at the beginning of the conference, belief through verification, that is through experience, right? And once you are in the mystical realm, then theological discussions or beliefs here or there disappear because you replace them with verification, right? So in that sense, I do believe that religions need to refocus, right? Help people achieve greater spiritual growth and an entry, right, into this block of consciousness. And I think somehow, until now, they have focused more on us having moral egos, right? On controlling behavior and believing this or that, right? But believing this or that is not very important for mystical consciousness, right? And of course, if you believe too rigidly in something, you're hindering, right, the entry into that transmental experience. The only thing you have to fully believe in is love, right? And only when you enter the block of consciousness will you deeply understand how love manifests. And until then, we will only have, well, intellectual ideas or beliefs or whatever, right? But that is normal. It's part of the evolutionary plan of God. It must be respected and it must be understood that when one is in the consciousness of the self, well, religion has played a very important role, right? In helping the world to have order, to, well, elevate morally and such. But when you enter mystical consciousness, religion, well, holds less weight, I believe.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo. A beautiful conference once again. Once again.
Well, thank you very much. And well, let's see if people don't get tired before we reach the 10th. But I think the 7th and 8th will indeed be very interesting, very practical as well. So I hope it builds up so that all of this gives us, well, a prior knowledge that we would need to have so that these other things that will come later are better understood, but they will be more practical.
Very well, very well. Fantastic, Gonzalo. So we are scheduled for next Thursday at 7 Spanish time, where Pablo will speak to us in the 5th session of the Universal Laws.
So it will be, God willing. Thank you very much to everyone and see you next Thursday. Okay.
See you next Thursday.
Thank you. Thank you.